My sister bullied me for years, then invited me to a dinner party where everyone had eaten, and ordered me to clean up like a pathetic waitress. My sister, Violet, has always been the golden child in our family, and my parents have never made an effort to hide that fact. Being the youngest, she was hailed as my parents' miracle baby. They had spent years trying to have another child after me, facing serious health obstacles along the way. After I was born, my mom experienced complications that led doctors to warn her against having more kids, basically telling my parents to give up on their hopes of a bigger family. But, 5 years later, my mom somehow defied all odds and found out she was pregnant again. That news was like a blessing straight out of the blue for my dad. He was thrilled at the idea of another child joining the family. This miracle baby label stuck with Violet from day one and shaped how my parents raised her. They went out of their way to make sure she had the best of everything, treating her like royalty. Every little achievement or milestone she reached became a big family event, celebrated with excitement and pride, reinforcing her special status. The favoritism wasn't subtle either. It was right out there in the open for everyone to see, including me. My parents never hesitated to show just how much they adored her, making it clear that Violet had a uniquely cherished place in their hearts. Now, don't get me wrong, my parents took care of me too. They made sure I had what I needed. But their attention toward me often felt secondary, like an afterthought. For example, if Violet and I both had school events on the same day, my parents would always choose hers. They'd tell me, "She's the youngest, she needs us more," as if whatever I had going on didn't matter as much. Then there were the photos. There are tons of childhood pictures of Violet, neatly arranged in albums my parents still treasure today. But for me? Not even a single album. They said all my pictures were lost in a storm. Sure, maybe that's true, but I can't help but wish they'd saved at least a handful. I would have loved to look back and see baby me. It's hard not to feel like I didn't matter as much when my childhood wasn't preserved the same way Violet's was. When it came to problems, Violet's were always top priority. If she had an issue big or small, my parents would drop everything to fix it. But if I needed something or voiced a complaint, my dad would brush me off, calling me spoiled. And if I struggled with anxiety or felt hesitant to try new things, my mom wasn't exactly supportive either. Instead of comforting me, she'd scold me, telling me to stop being dramatic and to be confident like Violet. Over time, I learned that my feelings and concerns didn't hold a candle to my sisters. And don't even get me started on the blame game. If Violet messed up, somehow, it was still my fault. My parents would say that as the older sibling, it was my job to guide her and teach her better. It didn't matter if I had nothing to do with whatever went wrong, I was always held accountable just because I was born first. Living with that kind of unjust blame only deepened the sense that I was less important, constantly stuck in Violet's shadow. Violet wasn't oblivious to this dynamic either. In fact, she used her favorite child status to her full advantage. She knew exactly how to twist situations in her favor, especially when it came to disagreements between us. She'd take my stuff without asking, clothes, belongings, whatever, and if I protested, she'd run to our parents, spinning a story that made me look selfish. Every single time, I'd end up being the one scolded for not sharing, while she got away with everything. But Violet didn't play by her own rules. She guarded her things fiercely, never letting me borrow or touch anything of hers. Back when we shared a room, she had her side locked down like it was sacred ground. Even after we moved into separate rooms, she stayed territorial, while still expecting me to hand over anything she wanted. It was exhausting to deal with her double standards, and it left me feeling like I was constantly on the losing end. Between Violet's manipulative ways and my parents always siding with her, I started to feel completely isolated. No matter what I did, I was always the bad guy, while Violet could do no wrong in their eyes. The constant favoritism and blame took a toll on me. By the time I was a teenager, I'd fallen into a deep depression. My self-confidence was in shambles, and I developed serious self-image issues. The anxiety I felt was unbearable, especially when Violet picked fights with me or mocked me. Living in constant fear of confrontation kept me on edge, and my parents' loud, aggressive yelling often pushed me to the brink of panic attacks. Whenever they got too close during one of their outbursts, I'd feel like the air was being sucked out of the room. It was like I couldn't breathe,
suffocating under the crushing weight of their anger and disappointment.
No one in my family ever seemed to notice or care about how much I was struggling. I felt trapped, like a caged animal, stuck in this endless cycle of emotional and psychological torment with no escape and no one to lean on for support. The only thing that brought me any sense of relief was writing in my journal. Every night, I'd pour my heart out onto those pages, spilling all my fears, frustrations, and sadness. That journal was the one place where I could be completely honest, where I could process the chaos around me and find a sliver of peace. I always kept it tucked away under my bed, terrified that Violet might find it and turn my most vulnerable thoughts into yet another way to mock me. One day, my worst fear became reality. Violet, who never respected my boundaries and had a bad habit of snooping through my things, found my journal while I was out. I'll never forget the way my heart sank when I walked into the living room that evening. My parents and Violet were sitting there, their faces unusually serious. For a split second, I thought something terrible had happened, maybe someone in the family had passed away. I asked if everything was okay, and my dad told me to sit down because they needed to talk to me. The moment I saw my mom pull my journal out from behind her back, my chest tightened. My eyes went wide with shock and disbelief, and I demanded to know why she had it. Violet sat there with a smug grin on her face, clearly enjoying my distress, while my mom, in an unusually stern tone, asked if everything I had written in it was true. In that instant, I felt so exposed, like my last shred of privacy had been ripped away. That journal had been my sanctuary, my safe space where I could be honest about the pain and frustration I was carrying. And now, all of it was out in the open, laid bare in front of the very people who had driven me to write those words in the first place. The weight of the situation hit me like a freight train, and I could feel a panic attack creeping in as I struggled to find the words to respond. All I could manage was a quiet, "Yes, it's true," followed by, "But you had no right to read it." My dad shook his head, his expression full of disappointment, and said that if what I had written was true, then they were deeply concerned about me. His words confused me. Before I could say anything, he went on to explain that after reading the journal, they believed I was harboring hatred toward them, that I was a psychopath who needed help. I was stunned. Completely blindsided. There wasn't a single hateful word about them in that journal. All I had done was document my experiences and the emotions their actions had caused over the years. But here they were, twisting my honest reflections into something ugly and unrecognizable. Then the accusations started flying. My mom claimed I was making everything up, that I was imagining things to fill my journal with lies. She told me I needed serious help before I ended up hurting someone. Violet, of course, chimed in, saying she was embarrassed to even call me her sister because my behavior wasn't normal. I tried to defend myself, explaining that the journal was just my way of processing everything I was going through and that I hadn't written anything bad about them. But they weren't interested in listening. They were locked into their narrative that I was the problem. Sitting there, exposed and vulnerable, I felt like they'd taken the last piece of me that was private and used it as ammunition against me. Then they told me the kicker: they'd made an appointment for me to see a psychiatrist the very next day. Their tone was dripping with a mix of condescension and faux concern, as if I were some ticking time bomb that needed defusing. It was clear they weren't trying to help me. They were trying to fix what they saw as the problem, and that problem was me. The betrayal ran deep. Their response didn't just hurt, it reinforced everything I'd already felt, that I was alone, isolated, and misunderstood. When I started seeing the psychiatrist, I carried this heavy sense of shame with me, as if I'd truly done something wrong. For a while, I even believed it. I bought into the idea that I was the problem. I was embarrassed to open up during those early sessions, scared to even share my feelings. But my psychiatrist was patient. She used my journal as a way to connect with me, reading excerpts and asking me questions based on what I'd written. That approach made me feel a little more comfortable, like she was genuinely trying to understand me instead of judging me. Writing had always been easier for me than speaking, so the journal became a lifeline in our sessions, a bridge that helped me start unpacking the chaos inside. Through the sessions, my psychiatrist slowly began to unravel the layers of my story, painting a clearer picture of the struggles I had kept hidden for so long. Week by week, I grew more comfortable with her. Little by little, I opened up about the life I had been forced to endure, the constant favoritism, the relentless blame, the emotional void, and the deep feelings of isolation that had shadowed me for as long as I could remember. For the first time, I felt truly seen. She listened without judgment and validated emotions I had been made to believe were irrational or exaggerated.
Gradually, I began to understand that I wasn't the problem.
My feelings were real, justified, and long overdue for acknowledgement. Eventually, she asked to bring my parents in for a session. I was nervous, unsure how they'd react, but I agreed. During that session, she confronted them directly, something I'd never seen anyone do before. She told them, in no uncertain terms, that their treatment of me as the lesser child was deeply damaging.
My parents were caught off guard, immediately becoming defensive.
My dad was quick to point out how hard they had worked to provide for me, while my mom argued that I should be grateful for everything they had done.
But my psychiatrist didn't back down.
She calmly reminded them that choosing to bring a child into the world came with the responsibility to nurture, support, and love, not just provide material needs. She then laid out, with painstaking detail, the instances I had shared with her, the favoritism, the blame, the emotional neglect. She explained how their actions had contributed to my anxiety, my depression, and my overwhelming sense of inadequacy. With every word, I saw my parents' defensiveness begin to crack. By the end of the session, they were speechless. For the first time, they looked shaken, as though they were beginning to grasp the consequences of their behavior. I wanted to believe that moment would lead to change, but my hope was short-lived. On the drive home, my dad announced that I would no longer be allowed to see the psychiatrist. He dismissed her as biased, saying she clearly didn't understand the truth about our family. My mom agreed, claiming therapy was a waste of money since I just wanted to blame them for everything. Her tone was laced with condescension, as though I had made up years of pain for attention. I felt crushed. The one glimmer of hope I had, the possibility that they might finally see me and take responsibility, was snuffed out in an instant. It was as if the session had never happened. They were determined to rewrite the narrative, casting themselves as the victims and me as the ungrateful child. Being a minor, I had no power to fight their decision or continue therapy on my own. The helplessness was suffocating, but I clung to what my psychiatrist had given me, the tools to process my emotions and the understanding that I wasn't to blame for their shortcomings. That realization changed everything. I made a decision that night to take control of my life. I poured every ounce of energy into my studies, determined to secure a future far away from the toxic environment I called home. My grades became my ticket to freedom, and I was relentless in my pursuit of that escape. At the same time, I began to withdraw emotionally. Around my family, I put up walls. I shut off my feelings, numbing myself to their words and actions to protect what was left of my sanity. I stopped journaling, too, knowing that even my most private thoughts weren't safe. Instead, I kept everything bottled up and focused on one goal: getting out. When I graduated with a full scholarship to a university far from home, my parents tried to stop me. They argued it was too far away, that I should stay closer. But I had already made up my mind. I packed my bags, took every important document I might need, and left without looking back. That day marked the beginning of my new life. I rarely answered their calls and never returned home for holidays. When they tried to guilt me into coming back, I shut them down, refusing to let their manipulation pull me back into the past. Violet? I erased her from my life completely. To me, she was nothing more than a distant memory. For the first time, I felt free. With that freedom, I built a future I could be proud of. I graduated with honors, landed an amazing job, and carved out a life that was mine alone. For years, I kept my parents at a distance, treating them with the same emotional detachment they had shown me for most of my life. But then, something unexpected happened. I was preparing for one of the happiest moments of my life, my wedding, when I heard from them again. Word of my upcoming marriage had reached them through relatives, and they called me out of the blue. Their voices were hesitant, almost uncertain. They apologized. They admitted to their mistakes, saying they regretted how they had treated me. For the first time, they acknowledged the hurt they had caused, even saying they couldn't change the past but hoped we could create new memories. They asked for a chance to be part of this new chapter in my life. Hearing their apology was overwhelming. I had spent years carrying the weight of their actions, and now, they were asking for forgiveness. It wasn't easy, but as I stood on the brink of starting my own family, I realized I didn't want to carry that bitterness any longer. I invited them to my wedding. They asked if Violet could come too, but I stood firm. The answer was no, and for once, they didn't argue. At the wedding, my parents seemed genuinely happy to be there. They mingled with the guests, smiled for the photos, and, for a brief moment, it felt like the wounds of the past were finally starting to heal. Looking back, I don't regret inviting them. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened, but about letting go, for myself, for my future, and for the life I was building. They were genuinely happy for me and my husband, and their joy made my decision to let them back into my life feel worthwhile. Since then, I've made an effort to visit my parents occasionally, usually for dinner, just to catch up. These visits, however, often come with one unwelcome caveat: interacting with Violet. She hasn't changed much. During our encounters, she still tries to provoke me with small, cutting comments about my marriage or my relationship with my in-laws. Her bitterness has only deepened over the years, especially after learning that I have a warm, loving bond with my husband's family, something she has never experienced with her own in-laws. By her own admission, her husband's family continues to dislike her and has never fully accepted her. I understand that this fuels much of her resentment, but that doesn't make her remarks any easier to stomach. Violet frequently makes snide comments about my husband or my in-laws, often trying to downplay their kindness or make petty jabs. Even my dad has noticed her behavior and has told her to stop, but she's relentless. Her frustration with her own life seems to seep into every interaction we have. 4 months ago, my husband and I received the most joyful news of our lives: I was pregnant. The happiness we felt was unmatched, and with his unwavering support, we decided together that I would temporarily leave my job to focus on the pregnancy. Given that he earns twice as much as I do, it was a practical decision that we both felt good about. My in-laws were over the moon and wholeheartedly supported our plan, offering help and reassurance at every turn. But, as expected, Violet didn't take the news well. When she found out I had chosen to step away from my career, she was furious. Her anger wasn't subtle, it was rooted in her own frustrations. Her husband had never allowed her to stay at home during her pregnancies, as their financial situation required both incomes to make ends meet. She never had the luxury of taking a break, and it clearly stung to see me doing what she couldn't. Her bitterness manifested in sharp remarks during family gatherings. She called me foolish for leaving my job and said it was humiliating to be a stay-at-home parent. I brushed off her comments with humor, calmly explaining that my years of experience would allow me to return to work whenever I chose. But Violet twisted the narrative, accusing my husband of being controlling and implying I had given up my independence. The irony wasn't lost on me, considering it was entirely my decision. I knew her words were less about me and more about her dissatisfaction with her own life. Still, I decided to keep my distance from her as much as possible, choosing to focus on my pregnancy and the happiness it brought me. A week ago, Violet called to invite us to a dinner party she was hosting. She mentioned that both our family and her in-laws would be there, and she wanted me and my husband to join. Since I hadn't been out much during my pregnancy, I saw it as a chance to socialize and distract myself. Plus, with so many people around, I figured Violet would have less time to fixate on me. I agreed to attend. The evening, however, didn't go as planned. On the day of the dinner, my husband was hit with last-minute work assignments that kept him tied up well into the evening. He apologized repeatedly, clearly stressed, but I reassured him that it was okay, I understood these things happen. By the time he finally came to pick me up, we were running quite late. Even then, I chose not to cancel, believing it was better to arrive late than not at all. When we got to Violet's house, it was clear we had missed most of the evening. The guests were finished with dinner and chatting casually. My parents had already left, as my dad doesn't like driving at night. Violet greeted us with an annoyed expression, scolding us for being late. I didn't blame her for being frustrated, it was her event, after all, but I quickly apologized on behalf of my husband, who looked genuinely embarrassed. She seemed to accept the apology, guiding him to a seat and handing him a plate of food, which I appreciated. But then, she pulled me aside into the kitchen. There, she bluntly informed me that there was no food left for me. Everyone had already taken second or third helpings, and the dishes were empty. Her tone wasn't apologetic, it was matter-of-fact, almost dismissive. I was taken aback. I was hungry. Pregnancy had only amplified my appetite, but I chose not to let my disappointment show. I knew we were late, and I didn't want to cause a scene. Instead, I calmly suggested ordering something online, assuring her it wasn't a big deal. It seemed like a simple solution to avoid any further tension. She nodded when I suggested ordering food and said she'd handle it, which seemed kind at first. But then she added, in a tone laced with irritation, that since I had arrived so late and hadn't helped during the evening, the least I could do now was clean up the dishes. Her request stunned me. I scoffed, unable to hide my disbelief, and told her I hadn't come to her dinner party expecting to be put to work, especially over something as trivial as being late. I didn't think it was reasonable for her to ask me to clean up after all her guests just because my timing wasn't ideal. Her reaction was swift and sharp. In a low, furious whisper, she snapped back, saying that as her sister, I should be helping her out. She reminded me that she had done all the cooking that day and pointed out how even our mother had helped serve the guests. According to her, I had no excuse not to pitch in. She also made it a point to highlight how her husband never helped in the kitchen, so she was counting on me for support. I bit back, telling her that if she felt so overwhelmed, she shouldn't have invited such a large crowd in the first place. That only made her angrier. She dismissed my comment entirely, saying I could never understand her situation, and then, with venom in her voice, she said something that cut me deeply. Now that you're pregnant, you're nothing more than a pathetic waitress for your husband at home. So, what's the big deal if you help me out too? Her words hit me like a slap. I was already feeling hungry, tired, and emotionally fragile, and her cruelty pushed me to the edge. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I refused to let her see how much she had hurt me. Without saying another word, I turned and walked out of the kitchen. I found refuge in one of the bedrooms, shutting the door behind me as quickly as I could. Inside, I felt the familiar weight of an oncoming panic attack. My chest tightened, and it felt like I couldn't breathe. The overwhelming mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and humiliation, made it almost impossible to calm down. I just hoped no one, especially my husband, would notice my absence or come looking for me. I needed this time alone to collect myself. As I sat there, trying to steady my breathing, my thoughts raced. The more I reflected on what had happened, the angrier I became. Violet had been cruel to me for years, and her behavior that night was just the latest chapter in a long, exhausting story. I realized I had reached my breaking point. Enough was enough. I decided it was time to take action. After pulling myself together, I scrolled through my phone, searching for the photos of my old journal entries. Years ago, when I moved out of my parents' house, I had taken my journals with me. Over time, I had digitized them, saving images of the pages in my email as a backup. Those entries documented everything Violet had put me through: the insults, the manipulation, the countless humiliations. That night, before my husband and I left Violet's house, I made the decision to send those photos to her husband, Isaac. Of all people, he was the one person Violet feared most when it came to judgment. I knew my parents might scold her for how she treated me, but they would never hold her accountable in a way that truly mattered. Isaac, on the other hand, had the potential to shake her up. In my message to him, I explained everything. I recounted how Violet had bullied me for years and shared how she had treated me at the dinner party, from inviting me only to humiliate me to her cruel comments about my pregnancy. I told him how her resentment seemed rooted in jealousy over my happy marriage and supportive in-laws. My goal wasn't to destroy their relationship, I simply wanted him to understand the full extent of her behavior and to see her for who she truly was. As expected, the fallout was explosive. Isaac confronted Violet, and their argument quickly escalated into a nasty fight. He later told our parents that the journal entries had opened his eyes to the reality of Violet's character. He admitted that he had always seen glimpses of selfishness and inconsideration in her, but he had never fully understood the depth of it until now. My mother, unsurprisingly, was furious with me. She felt I had crossed a line by involving Isaac and exposing Violet's behavior. She blamed me entirely for their fight. My dad, on the other hand, remained more neutral. While he didn't openly support my decision, he also didn't condemn me for it. Update 1. After the dinner party, I told my husband everything Violet had said to me in the kitchen. He was livid. During the party, he hadn't realized the full extent of what had happened, but once I filled him in, he decided to confront Violet directly. He called her and made it clear that her behavior was unacceptable and that she needed to stop making derogatory comments about our family. I've never seen him so upset, and I can only imagine how shaken Violet must have been by his reaction. Update 2. Isaac later reached out to me to talk about what had happened. He shared that his family had always viewed Violet as selfish and inconsiderate, but he had defended her because he loved her. Seeing my journal entries and hearing my side of the story was a turning point for him. For years, he had believed Violet's version of our relationship, which conveniently left out her role as the aggressor. Now, he finally understood the depth of the issues between us. During our conversation, Isaac asked for more details, and I was happy to provide them. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding the full story, and I appreciated his willingness to listen. While I don't know what the future holds for their relationship, I feel a sense of relief knowing that Violet's behavior is no longer hidden behind a mask. I recounted all the painful experiences I had endured as a child, emphasizing how my parents consistently favored Violet over me. I described in detail how their favoritism had shaped so much of my life, how it made me feel overlooked, unsupported, and, at times, completely invisible. I shared how my psychiatrist had even tried to address these issues with my parents, urging them to reflect on their behavior, but they had been unwilling to take responsibility for their actions. It wasn't until I had almost cut them off after leaving for college that they began to acknowledge their faults, but by then, the damage had already been done. As I opened up, Isaac listened intently. Eventually, he began to share his own experiences with Violet. He admitted that she sometimes treated him in the same dismissive, harsh manner. He confessed that he had always written it off as just Violet being Violet, chalking it up to her personality rather than a deeper problem. But after hearing how she had bullied me relentlessly over the years, even well into adulthood, he was forced to confront the possibility that this wasn't just her normal behavior. What troubled him most was the fear that Violet might be treating their child the same way she had treated me, behind his back, without his knowledge. The thought clearly weighed heavily on him, and he admitted that it had made him rethink everything about their relationship. For the first time, he was beginning to see the full extent of who Violet was, and it wasn't a pretty picture. Update 3. I want to address some of your questions and clear things up once and for all. First, as you might expect, Violet blames me entirely for everything that has happened. She has sent me several nasty messages since the party, accusing me of ruining her life and her marriage. The messages were relentless until my husband stepped in to put a stop to them. He called her directly and made it crystal clear that she was to leave me alone. Since then, Violet hasn't reached out or said another word to me. Second, my mother has been insistent that I apologize not just to Violet, but to Isaac as well. She wants me to tell him that I exaggerated the incidents from my childhood and essentially downplay everything. She believes this will help smooth things over with Violet and repair their marriage. But I've stood firm in my decision. I refuse to apologize. I made it clear to her that if she continues to side with Violet and push me to retract the truth, my husband and I will cut her off completely. My dad, on the other hand, has been more understanding. While he hasn't openly supported my actions, he sees why I felt the need to act as I did and hasn't tried to pressure me into apologizing. Lastly, I don't know what Isaac will ultimately decide regarding his relationship with Violet. That's entirely up to him. My goal was never to destroy their marriage, it was to hold Violet accountable for her actions and to make her realize that she can't continue putting me down without consequence. I don't regret what I've done. For years, I kept my head down, endured her cruelty, and allowed her to walk all over me. That time is over. Violet needed to be exposed for who she really is, and I feel at peace knowing I stood up for myself. Now, whatever happens next is out of my hands. It's up to Isaac to decide what's best for his future and for their child.